Hello, my name's Tim Horton. I'm the pianist with Ensemble 360, and I'm joined today by Professor Laura Tunbridge of St Catherine's College, Oxford. And we're going to talk about Beethoven's Opus 7 Piano Sonata in E-flat major. So, Laura, first of all, thank you for coming and joining us. Or thank you for staying at home, I should say.
I have little choice about that at this point.
This piece was written in about 1796, 97, that sort of thing. And I just wondered, first of all, if it might be worth asking you just to give a bit of context about the circumstances under which it was written.
Yes, so Beethoven is living in Vienna at this point, but he makes a tour in November 1796 to Bratislava and Budapest, as they're now known. And whilst he's there in Bratislava, he gives some concerts at the Kedlevich Palace, and he stays there and gives some piano lessons to their 16-year-old daughter, Babette, who's obviously a very fine pianist, and he dedicates this piano sonata to her, and also actually the revised first piano concerto as well. So he's giving her lessons, but also in some ways paying homage to her or in gratitude to her family, dedicating this work, perhaps with a view to her playing it, or certainly with a view to her owning it, having the chance to play it for 6 months, as was the way that people dealt with publications at that time.
This piece, obviously, it's a very, I think after the Hammerklavier Sonata, it's actually the longest of the sonatas. So it's quite significant in that sense. It's also significant because it has its own opus number, and all the other, I think I'm right in saying that all the other sonatas up to, well, Opus 2, Opus 10, so 6 of those sonatas are within sets. So it's obvious that he felt, presumably he felt this was too long to be part of a set. It could easily have been part of Opus 2, I suppose, ultimately. Do you think there's any other reason why he would have given it its own opus number, except apart from the length?
It's difficult to tell, but he also calls it a grand sonata, so there's an acknowledgement there that it is a weightier piece than the sets.
Yes.
Anything more specific than that, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, but it is interesting because a lot of pieces at that time, he's writing, as you say, groups of pieces, but also writing quite a lot of what we now think of as, if not ephemera, then more entertainment-like pieces, arrangements of opera airs and things for four-hand piano, that is not the kind of genre that we associate with Beethoven these days. So this sonata then stands as something more serious and substantial.
There are various things that I want to talk to you about. One of the things that I was thinking about was, I was talking to a friend the other day who pointed out that there are no, I think I'm right in saying, no known sketchbooks before the Opus 10 piano sonatas. So we don't know about the compositional processes necessarily before that time, in the way that, of course, we have very detailed sketchbooks for a lot of the pieces. And Beethoven was known as a great improviser, which we know about, but also that his compositional processes were very tortured. I mean, he'd spend a long time working out the details, and sometimes what you see in sketchbooks of the initial ideas have very little to do with what eventually made it into the piece. To what extent, this may be an impossible question to answer, but to what extent do you think the element of improvisation was more relevant for these early pieces, given that he was at that time performing and improvising, rather than the later sort of very detailed sketching?
I mean, so far as we know, my suspicion is that improvisatory practice is important for quite a long time in terms of working out his ideas. What we know from this piece is there's a transitional theme between the first and second subject in the first movement, which is actually noted down as a piano improvisation, and then finds its way into the sonata. So there's obviously a feed from improvisation into composition and working out. And at this point, he is sketching things out, but not documenting them, not keeping them in the same way as he does later in his career. So it does seem as if his practices change as he becomes more mature, as he's composing more in some ways, and writing larger scale pieces and having to think on a grander scale as well. So you can see, I think there's probably an argument to be made for continuity between them, rather than saying there's a certain point where actually improvisation no longer matters, because actually he continues playing, he has access to instruments, and he's composing for performers as well. So that relationship between performance, improvisation, and composition is still there, and I think is probably important for a number of decades after this piece.
Right. Yes, I think that's exactly. We tend to, I suppose, the same with the sort of the idea of early, middle, and late. We like to sort of categorize things that are not always that straightforward.
It's always the case that the boundaries get blurred, and you think, well, okay, so he stops doing this. But on the other hand, there's this other example from later on where he does just what you said that he doesn't anymore. So, I mean, that's just the way of people working and the different situations in which people compose.
That sort of brings me on in a way to something about these early pieces. I mean, not just the piano sonatas, but also the early quartets, and something to do with for me, the slow movements, which are particularly extraordinary in these pieces, in the Opus 2 sonatas and this sonata, the Opus 18 string quartets, of course, as well. They seem to be incredibly emotionally mature for someone so young. I mean, that's something that strikes me so much about these. I mean, the other movements, of course, are wonderful, and they're also very much mature, but the slow movements always have some change of color. But the slow movements, the Opus 2 number 3 sonata, you have a piece in C major, you have a piece in E major, which is, relatively speaking, quite a distant key, and in terms of color is a very distant key. So when you hear the beginning of that movement, it's quite a surprise. In this piece, in Opus 7, piece in E flat major, the second movement's in C major, which is, again, quite a surprise, I think. I mean, the traditional thing would have been to be in B flat major or A flat major, maybe at a push or whatever. So there is definitely, he's clearly, first of all, doing something very different with these slow movements that other composers do as well. Of course, it's not that he's the first person to do this. But it also, to me, seems to presage certain things that you can see in his later music. I mean, it's not just early music, early Beethoven in inverted commas. Is that fair to say?
I think so. And actually, I wonder whether, when we talk about the scale of this piece, it's something to do with its expressive range as well. I mean, to think about why it's so long, it's partly there's a lot of music, but there's also a lot of emotion within it, particularly in the slow movement. As you say, it needs space to breathe, and it's that artistic imagination, or whatever you want to call it, that I think gives it a greater breadth that adds to the grandness of this sonata. I think something we've talked about in the past is actually how in this slow movement, the way he's using gestures and silence, and actually how the music continues from quite simple material in some ways, but kind of builds up into something, and how he's using the sonority of the instrument to create a particular sound world, which is emphasized by dynamics and range and register and that kind of thing. So I think it is interesting, and I think it is true that continues and extends as his career goes on, to really give some kind of weight to slow movements. When we talk about Beethoven, and particularly heroic Beethoven, so the following decade of this, we tend to always talk about finales and energy and heading towards the end, rather than actually thinking there are these moments of repose and contemplation within these pieces, which are as important, maybe not quite so, I don't know, storming the barricades, but actually emotionally very significant.
Yeah. So yes, what you're saying about the idea of gesture and in that slow movement, I mean, he marks it con gran espressione, which is quite a daunting marking because it obviously means a lot. And if you underplay it, it's sort of, you're not really engaging enough with it. But the question is how much to make of. I mean, the silences are not just silences, of course, they're rests. So they are, there is a particular pulse which we still need to feel within those silences. But of course, it depends on how you gesture the first two notes, the first two chords. Is it that, or is it does it go on? All these sort of things that you have to sort of decide for yourself. But there is something about, for me, I mean, the fact that the silences in that movement, in the second movement, are particularly dramatic because he sets up gestures at the very beginning, and then later you get silences that he will then interrupt with really quite violent chords. and then later it's still in the movement. The silences that you heard at the beginning are then filled in with this sort of improvisatory thing. So there are all sorts of little tiny ways of playing with the expectations of these silences, which is, I think, particularly remarkable. And that's in a way how the expression, that's where the expression comes from, if you like.
Yes. And it's hard to think of at that point in the 1790s of people using that kind of gesture in that way. It's something I think you associate more with later Beethoven and Romantics, I suppose.
There's a popular view that we have Mozart, then have Haydn, well, I mean, obviously, similar time, and then we have Beethoven. Now, of course, something that people don't talk about so often is that these early sonatas in particular are influenced as much, if not more, by Clementi and his sonatas than by Mozart and Haydn. I'm ashamed to say I only know one Clementi sonata. There's an F-sharp minor sonata, which is rather wonderful, I think. But why do you think that link is not more often talked about?
I think actually it's partly that, as you say, people tend not to know the repertoire quite so well. There's a political angle to it as well, in the sense that if you say it's like Mozart and Haydn, then you're already putting Beethoven in the great pantheon of Viennese classicism, which is true, but they weren't the only composers around, and actually not necessarily the most played or most respected in some, I mean, respected, yes, but most popular composers as well. And it's a bit like any of these musical family trees, if you will. You tend to go for the biggest names and say, well, of course, Beethoven is going to learn most from Mozart and Haydn because they are the ones that he's then put with as a grand master. If you say, actually, he's more like Clementi or Maiseder in quartet composition or Cherubini in opera, that's fine, but we don't know that music so much anymore. And actually then it seems as if he's more of his time and derivative in a negative way, rather than taking inspiration from past masters as we want to think of him being. So it's worth remembering that there's an awful lot of music making going on in Vienna, and actually he's making his name amongst contemporaries who aren't necessarily the people that we remember now, but whose music, some of it at least, is certainly worth seeking out and trying to work out what it is that Beethoven's taking from it or responding to or resisting in some ways.
So the same thing holds true for what happens after Beethoven as well. I mean, the influence of Beethoven is so strong, but it then we forget the influence of other composers on people like Brahms. Brahms' Second Piano Concerto has almost nothing to do with Beethoven in some ways. It has much more to do with other people writing piano concertos in the 19th century. And so it's a shame in a way. I mean, obviously we don't hear a lot of this music, and I'm ashamed to say I don't play any Clementi. Maybe I should. But it makes things rather more interesting, I think, if we do consider these things, because then you see what a sort of musical melting pot these places were. I mean, particularly, of course, Vienna at this time, and that he's not just existing in some bubble that is created around Mozart and Haydn. There's so much more going into it. And then you see this music again. I mean, there's this sort of tendency, isn't there, to see these composers as somehow sent from heaven, and they have nothing to do with the everyday life. But of course, he's just as susceptible to influence as any other composer. So. Yeah.
Oh yes, and he's very human. I mean, all of the stories around. Okay, there are the stories of his eccentricity at this time, but. Yes, I mean he's busy. He's working the salons in Vienna. He's trying to play for people and get his music played. He's a mover and shaker, is a cliche, but there's an element of that with the young Beethoven, that he is just trying to establish himself and take the opportunities he can get. Actually, my question for you is to do exactly with playing at home versus playing in the concert hall, which in some ways is closer to how this sonata was first performed, because it was for somebody that Beethoven was teaching. It would have been performed in a palace, so okay, a fairly grand surrounding, but still not the public concert that we have today. And I just wonder whether that feels different to you from playing on a concert platform as you would have been, or in the round, whatever, but to a larger audience, and whether you think about how you project the music differently because of the situation that you're playing in.
Well, one thing about this situation, which is quite a blessing for me, is that it's enabled me to work in a way that I don't normally work. I mean, I do record myself sometimes and listen back, but with this, of course, I've had to record everything and listen back to everything. And what it does is it shows you, first of all, what you think you're doing but isn't coming across, which is very often the case. Because, of course, in a concert hall, as you say, I mean, you do tend to project more. You tend to project ideas more strongly. You are also reacting to the fact there's an audience there, which immediately affects the way you play. I think in a concert, I'd be far less concerned with wrong notes than I am in this context. I mean, there's a certain level of inaccuracy which I've allowed into it, but there's a level beyond that that you don't want to go into. So that occasionally you do a take, think, oh, this is okay, and then suddenly something really quite unpleasant happens. You think, well, that's just too much, you know. Now, of course, there are all these wonderful recordings from early 20th century to mid 20th century of Cortot and Rubinstein, all these wonderful people with fistfuls of wrong notes, and it simply doesn't matter. It's very. I'm not comparing myself to them by any means, but because of what we're used to and what I'm used to, I can't really let that go. But I think, yeah, the thing I've struggled with most is that pitching the gestures in the right way so that they have enough expression, enough force, if you like, of expression. And for example, today I've recorded the last movement about 4 times. And I did one this morning. I thought, oh, that's okay, that'll do. Listened back to it, and it was the most boring thing I've ever heard in my life. It just sounded like I was just trying to get it right, you know. So, and you'd never do that in a concert, or you'd very rarely do that in a concert, I think. So it's a difficult balance, I think, between trying to get some sort of spontaneity and trying to get a recording that's sort of vaguely acceptable. Yeah. Thank you, Laura, for doing this. You, as I say, just to recap, you will be able to hear a lot of music over the 15th and 16th of May online. Look at the Music in the Round website if you want to see more details of how to access those concerts and talks. And thank you again, Laura.